So I'm gonna do this video really as an intro video to this channel and the journey I'm heading on. But to do that, I'll kind of start with my backstory. I was always quite bendy and hypermobile, but we thought it was funny. Like, I would walk around and like bend my finger back to like touch my wrist and like put my body in weird position. But yeah, so I'm quite used to dislocating things, and we just attribute it to the fact that I was like clumsy. We kind of ignored all of that. We knew something was up. When I was younger, I had a family doctor who were pretty convinced, just like read a medical journal about connective tissues disorders, and he walked in the room and he was like, you know what, I just read this thing. I think you have Marfan syndrome, which if you've done any research about Marfan's, it does kind of go in the same family as like Marfan's, Loewy Dietz, Ehlers-Danlos, but Marfan's is very, very dangerous. So he actually sent me for $50-some thousand of genetic testing, and I in fact do not have Marfan syndrome. But we're a little disappointed because he just was like, oh, okay, and dropped it, which we're like, you know, you were on the right path, buddy. Like, why didn't we push that anymore? But so it was years later. I was a cheerleader and gymnast, which is probably the worst things I could have done to my body, but we didn't know. And I was doing a back tuck, but I'd been doing it all day, and I don't know what happened, but I fell on my neck. And I knocked some of my vertebrae out of line. I completely damaged the ligaments in there. I had a massive concussion. So I turned my like C curve in my spine from like one direction completely the opposite way. So it was a pretty severe injury. But then just a couple years after that, I had another concussion. And it kind of went on that pathway. Once you have one concussion, you're massively more likely to have many concussions. I am on concussion number 4 or 5 in 10 years. So we kind of have looked back over my history and kind of see that first fall and neck injury as kind of the precipice for all these problems. So that was my sophomore year of high school, and my senior year of high school, I missed like 30 days of school. I was very sick, being seen at Children's Hospital, where they diagnosed me with POTS, or postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. Basically, when you lay down, like all is well and dandy, but any change in gravity there, like sitting or standing, your blood pressure drops and your heart rate soars, which just makes you faint. And so at that point, that was kind of the only problem. Like, you just have this POTS. They said drink a lot of Gatorade, eat a lot of really salty foods. And so that kind of worked for a number of years, and all throughout college, things were fairly okay. Then 2015 hit with a really rough year. It seemed like everything was back with a vengeance, and at this point in time, I was living in Washington, D.C., going to grad school. So it was really a blessing that it happened then, because, you know, I was surrounded with Johns Hopkins and George Washington and Georgetown, like some of the best hospital facilities that I could have been seen at. So I was seen by a number of specialists throughout those systems. So it was a pretty quick diagnosis of POTS, actually. I know a lot of people really struggle, get told they're making things up, get told they're anxious or depressed. My POTS diagnosis was quick and great, but like I said, it was getting a little bit more unmanageable. I think I was in the ER like 6 times. So I decided to kind of look into things a little bit more, and we had this seed planted with this Marfan's. So we were pretty sure I had a genetic connective tissue disorder called Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, or EDS, but didn't ever have testing done because there's nothing they can do for it. So our thought was, you know, what does it matter? Like, why do we care if I have it or not? But I was at the point where I was getting married and wanting to have a child, so I wanted to know what that looked like for future generations. So I went to see a geneticist at Hopkins genetic clinic, and I waited 18 months for that appointment. But when I went, they pretty quickly diagnosed me with the hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome. There are many different kinds, ranging from this hypermobility one, where it is a clinical diagnosis, to ones they can do, tests for where like organs can spontaneously combust. So Ehlers-Danlos is a connective tissues disorder where my body produces faulty collagen, so my joints are very hypermobile. Like you can do a number of like weird things with your joints, and I don't know, they like are all bendy, and they dislocate, sublocate. So for most of my life it was just dislocating and wearing braces and laughing at it and thinking it was funny, but then this year it has gone from funny, like, oh look, my joint, another one popped out, to really life altering, where it's been impacting like my brain and my spinal cord. Yeah, I got diagnosed with that, and then I ended up pregnant. When I was delivering, I ended up with stalled labor and we had to do an epidural, and then after that is kind of when everything changed. So I ended up with a really bad positional headache. When I would sit up, it was just like the worst headache. So they told me to lay down. Like sometimes that happens with epidural, you can get a little leak there, it's not a big deal, it'll heal itself, drink a lot of caffeine, you'll be fine. So a couple of days later I still could not sit up, like my head hurt so bad, and they were very dismissive. They had the anesthesiologist come up and make it sound like it was this huge ordeal to fix the leak from the epidural. They convinced me it would go away, it would be fine. It is not a big deal at all. And that's fair. For a normal person, it would not be a big deal at all. Sometimes you can get a little escape of spinal fluid, which can cause that positional headache, when you're laying down versus when you're sitting up, and kind of how the pressure of your spinal fluid is. But for a normal person, it probably would heal pretty quickly. But what we're thinking happened is mine just never healed. So about 2 years later, I ended up in the ER with terrible headaches, and I've lived a life of chronic illness. I don't take going to the ER lightly, so for me to go, they were so bad. I was throwing up, I could not stand up, so I went and they did a lumbar puncture. So they inserted the needle into my spinal column to kind of get the spinal fluid and test it, and the spinal fluid came back no problems. So they told me I was having a migraine and sent me home. So 2 days after that, or the next day, I woke up in the worst pain of my whole life. Like the middle center of my back where my spine is, like, I don't even know how to describe it. It felt like my bones, my vertebrae were rubbing each other. I was in agony, so bad. It was, childbirth felt like a scraped knee compared to it. So I went back to the ER and the doctor was like, I'm really sorry, but we're gonna have to redo the spinal tap or lumbar puncture. And he did. And I don't know if you've all had spinal taps, but they're not, it's not that fun having needles stuck in your back. So he's like in there and he's digging around and it's like so painful. It's triggering nerves like going down my legs. And I'm like, oh my God, please stop. And I hear him talking to the other person helping him. He's like, what is going on? Okay, I'm gonna try again. And so when he finally got done, he was like, I don't know what to say, but there was no spinal fluid. He was like, I am in the right place. I have never seen this. There is no spinal fluid in your spine. And so we're like, like, what does that mean? So it turns out that what we're thinking is that I had been leaking from the epidural for probably 2.5 years, 2 years. And then when they did that second, things had just been like getting worse and worse and worse. And then when they did that first spinal tap, it just was like, I don't know what happened, but it was a very, very severe spinal fluid leak. So I ended up in the ICU for a few days. They did a blood patch, which is where they take your blood and then they inject it into your spine with the idea that it would kind of coagulate and form like a scab and heal you. So it did patch my leak, the really bad one, but it still didn't feel like it ever fixed any of the issues I initially went to the ER for. And we think the reason for that CSF leak being so bad was because of the connective tissues being faulty, because they are, they happen throughout your whole body. This can also be a big reason for the POTS, the connective tissues around your hearts and around your veins. again, are faulty. So the EDS really is kind of the underlying beast there for all these comorbidities. So I continued seeing a neurologist who sent me to a headache specialist in Morgantown, West Virginia, and then I saw a neurosurgeon, where I ended up having a head to tailbone MRI. It was about 3 hours of laying on the table, not being able to move, which sounds so minor in like medical land, but it was really hard, like laying on that flat table and not being able to move for 3 straight hours. It was really painful. And then with my EDS, my joints pop out really easily, so like laying there, you know, my shoulder would pop out, which would then put my elbow in a weird place, so it would pop out. So yeah, anyway, from that we found that I have a Chiari malformation. With that is kind of where we're at now. We found this Chiari malformation, which basically means that the bottom part of your brain, the cerebellum, is falling out of the skull, falling down, like herniating into the spinal column, which can do a number of things, like block the flow of spinal fluid to your brain. It can cause a buildup of spinal fluid in your spinal column. It can cause a number of neurological issues. So it can cause massive headaches, which I kind of have all of those problems, like from pain to memory issues to, like, my neurosurgeon was going over my entire body and poking me with the safety pin, the pointy end, and I just couldn't feel it. Issues with motor skills, like my hands don't really work anymore. So yeah, it's just not a lovely place to be in. So I sought out a Chiari specialist. Probably one of the world's leading Chiari specialists is in Silver Spring, Dr. Fraser Henderson, which I'll go more into depth in another video because this is quite long already. But he also found something else on some of my imaging called craniocervical instability and atlantoaxial instability, both of which are just meaning that there's a lot of instability in my vertebrae in my neck. So again, that EDS is just causing all of this, you know, and it's one thing when it's like my wrist popped out of place, but it's another thing when your neck is popping out of place. So I saw him a couple weeks ago. He put me in the neck brace because he said my situation is pathological and very dangerous. Sent me for some more imaging, which I'll go more into depth in another video. But basically it came back that the prognosis is not good. My neck is severely unstable, kind of like a ticking time bomb. So to combat that, we are going to be doing a craniospinal fusion and a decompression surgery. That tick right there is one of the neurological problems of the Chiari. But anyway, that will kind of work to decompress my brain. We'll give a little bit more room for the brain by removing some of the skull, and then they will attach a plate to the skull and fuse it to the first and second vertebrae of the spine with screws. So that should combat some of the instability. And he believes a lot of the neurological symptoms, the fainting, which would be great. So yeah, that's kind of an overall a bird's eye view of my long-winded medical history, but I just wanted to put something out there that kind of explained like my story and where I'm coming from, and